All right. Uh, let's get started today. We have a very exciting program to share with you today. So we'll get started right ahead. So my name is Omar Alcover, and I'm an educator and content specialist at LACMA's education department. I received my MA and my PhD in anthropological archaeology from Brown University, where my specialization was working closely with communities both in Guatemala and Mexico, studying early Maya archaeological sites. And we are very lucky to be joined today by Jessica Chasen. Jessica is an associate objects conservator at LACMA, where she is responsible for the study and care of three-dimensional objects from across the museum's encyclopedic collection. She earned her Master's of Science degree from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation and trained at the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco, the Brooklyn Museum, the Museum of Modern Arts, and the Rijksmuseum. And prior to joining LACMA in 2019, Jessica worked at the Paul Getty Museum and at the Getty Conservation Institute. We're also very lucky to be joined today by Laura Schilling. Laura is the coordinator for teacher programs at LACMA and organized all the events that we've been participating in this week. So thank you for joining us, and we're very excited to have you here for our last session of Evening for Educators. And before we get started with the program today, we would like to acknowledge that the museum and the communities that we serve are on the ancestral lands of the Tongva, the Tataviam, and the Chumash indigenous communities. We recognize them as the first people of this land where we live and work. So today, what we want to do is discuss how you can use 3D models from LACMA's collection as educational resources for you and your students. So just to give you an overview, first, I will discuss how to access these materials and some of the thinking strategies that can be used to foster curiosity and critical observation by students using these digital resources. Then, we're going to present some contextual information on the house model from Mezcala, which is the main object we'll be discussing today. And then we're going to follow that with a conversation with Jessica on the role of conservators in the museum and how they provide critical expertise in understanding how art objects are made and what are some of the best ways to preserve them for future audiences. So the first thing I want to emphasize is all of the 3D models that we have from LACMA's collections are made publicly available on our Sketchfab page. Now, there are multiple ways that you can access this Sketchfab page, and we encourage you throughout our session today, if you have a separate browser that you can open while watching this, or you can have us just looking at us and looking at the objects at a separate screen, what you can do is on a smart device, either your phone or a tablet, you can scan this QR code. So if you open the camera application on a mobile device, it'll open up a little link that you can click and it'll take you directly to the Sketchfab object. Another way that you can access this is through a direct link to those resources. And Laura now is going to share some of these resources, some of these links on the chat, so it can make it very easy for you to be able to access. Now, a third option, if none of these resources are working or none of these links are working, you can simply Google LACMA and Sketchfab, and it'll direct you to LACMA's Sketchfab page. Now, Sketchfab is simply a repository for digital materials, but specifically 3D models. And at the museum, we have been developing a whole series of these objects to make them accessible to our audiences now that the museum is closed due to COVID-19. So you can access these materials from the computer, and this is a representation of how it might look like. In this case, it's the Mezcala house model that we're going to be talking about today. So you can see we have the LACMA logo, the structure in the middle, and you can move it around. You can actually manipulate and zoom in, zoom out, look at the different pieces of textures, and really get to the centimeter level of detail on these objects, which is really something we don't get to experience in the physical world, right? When you're at a museum, you don't necessarily are able to zoom into the finer details of an object. And this is an opportunity to allow you to do that, to really get into the nitty-gritty of these materials. Um, but let's say you want to access these maybe in a classroom or in a different setting. You can also gain access to this through Sketchfab's mobile applications. So this is just a couple images from my phone to show you how they look up on a mobile device. So you can see we have the list of the different objects, and you can zoom in on specific ones and manipulate it the same way you would manipulate it on a computer or on a different mobile device, right? But the mobile device allows you to do a little bit more with these objects than the computer. You can actually place them into the real world through virtual reality. So for example, I have the object here placed on a shelf in my apartment. You can see it, you can place these objects in conversation with other objects that you have in your house, maybe different bowls or plates, or even, as I put in this picture, with my plants, right? So you can just imagine the different ways you can make this object interact with spaces in the real world, right? And like I mentioned before, all of these objects are available to you for free online, so you can view them at any moment that you so desire. Now, for when we're thinking about using these materials with our students, with our colleagues, and with other people that we really want to start thinking about art and art objects together, there are a few thinking strategies that we want to propose to you that are good to use when observing and thinking about these objects. And Laura is going to be posting some of these in the chat, and I want to go through a little exercise together. I'm going to read these questions, and then I'm going to place a different image of the object, and I want to hear from you. I want to see, for example, what do you see? What do you think this artwork is about? And what do you wonder? What questions do you have about this work of art that you're interested about learning more, either through today's experience or more after today, on your own time when you're researching these materials and looking at different objects from LACMA's collection? So I'll give you a moment to think through and see what kind of questions, what kind of answers you may have. And again, these questions are, what do you see? What do you think this artwork is about? And what do you wonder? What questions do you have? And once these answers start trickling in, I'm gonna have Laura read some of them together so we can have this experience as a group. And again, I've included this QR code on the top right corner in case you wanna open the object for yourself. And again, the way to do that is you open your smart device camera, and it should direct you to the different, to the actual Sketchfab webpage where you can manipulate this. So if you're watching this on your computer and you have a smartphone, you can open the model through there. It's a very easy way to open it that way. So let's hear from some folks. What do you see?
Hey, Omar. So some responses are starting to come into the chat. Holly sees 4 columns. She also sees a base that the columns are on top of. Similarly, Brandon sees columns and steps. Loretta is curious about the size.
Yeah.
Moises says it reminds them of the Parthenon, so they're wondering maybe what came first historically, the Parthenon or this object, if maybe there was
that's a good question.
Someone says they know, Dara says she knows it's a small object, so it may be something that was used as a good luck charm.
Yes, that's a good point. It is a small object and something we'll discuss further on. These are all great observations. Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you much everybody for chiming in on the chat with these observations. So hopefully we'll get to answer some of these questions along our today's presentation and our conversation with Jessica. But I want to provide a little bit more context about what we know so far. So I'll start by saying that as with many objects from the ancient Americas, we unfortunately do not know the names of the indigenous artists or artists that created these beautiful architectural models. Despite not knowing exactly who produced this work, the model is exemplary of the Mezcala artistic tradition, which is known for its carved human figures with that showcase animals as well as two-dimensional house models that are made out of stone with clean geometric lines. So the term Mezcala is used both to refer to the artistic tradition, the artistic tradition, as well as the indigenous community that thrived in the Balsas River region of Western Mexico in the state of Guerrero. The term was given by artist and scholar Miguel de Covarrubias, taking it from the village of the same name, which is located on the slopes of the Cañón del Sopilote in Guerrero. And we see in this map, we have a very simplified version of what the region of Mesoamerica is, including some of its different sub-regions, including the Maya area, the Huasteca area, West Mexico, and but specifically I've highlighted in bolder text Guerrero, which is the area that we're going to be focused on today. So this object is associated with some of the earliest people living in the region. And Mezcala style objects were likely made between 500 BCE and 350 CE. The extensive date range for their production reflects the ambiguous context that we have for most of these objects. Only a handful of Mezcala style objects have been recovered from archaeological excavations, where their location and relationships to other materials will be minutely recorded. Most ancient objects from this region, and from a lot of areas in the Americas, unfortunately, were looted illicitly from burials and other contexts, which complicates our understanding of where and when they were produced. But from the information at hand, though, this architectural model made by the indigenous people of the Balsas River region present an early and well-developed specialization in stone sculpture, a unique artistic tradition that continues to attract and inspire viewers today, like us. Now, as a potential house model, we know that these models are supposed to represent, or are believed to represent, two-dimensional renderings of four-post houses with thatched roofs, similar to this rendition of a Nayarit house group that was likely contemporary to the model that we are discussing today. So houses with elevated platforms and four-corner posts, which a lot of you noticed in our exercise, are common across ancient Mesoamerica, with many indigenous communities still building and using traditional methods, tools, and community support. So these houses are the product of large communities coming together and building these, right? And so although they're sometimes referred to as temple models, they're most likely representations of houses, flattened, two-dimensional, right? And for different Mesoamerican indigenous communities, houses were pivotal spaces of everyday life as well as sacred spaces, modeling the four-cornered universe writ small. And I know Laura has discussed a little bit about this on Monday, but there is this very intimate relationship in Mesoamerican and indigenous thought and relates to houses. So for a lot of indigenous communities, and particularly we can say this about, for example, my communities that I've worked with, the houses are the universe writ small, and the universe is a house writ large. So there's this constant back and forth between these spaces that make them a super important thing in their mythology and their worldview. And in terms of the Mezcala house models particularly, these architectural models seem to be especially made to accompany the deceased in their burials. During this time, the Mezcala objects were produced, indigenous communities buried their ancestors underneath floors. And we actually may have a representation of that here. You can see that at the bottom of the step, there's somebody that's crouched there. That might represent somebody that's buried underneath this house. So as grave goods, these objects held an important ritual significance for the communities that produce and use them. And so just as a house protects people during life, these models may have served to protect people in the afterlife, making them a very essential object for the communities they belong to. Now, before switching gears and turning to the actual 3D model and started talking with Jessica, I'd like to give everybody another opportunity to open this model for yourself if you have the chance. So again, here's a QR code that you can access using smartphones or a mobile device's camera. You can visit the LACMA Sketchfab page that was put in the chat and is presented here before, or you could simply Google LACMA and Sketchfab and then just search for the object that we're going to see here. It's the only Mezcala style house model in our digital resources right now, so it's going to be very easy for you to find and locate within the Sketchfab page. So I'm going to switch over to our 3D model here. And, you know, and we're, like I said before, we're very lucky to have Jessica here. And, you know, Jessica, as a conservator, you look at objects like this house model and other similar materials all the time. But, you know, can you tell us a little bit to our audience, what do you do as a conservator? What's the role of the conservator at the museum?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me today. I'm excited to look more closely at this house model together and talk a little bit about conservation at LACMA. So a conservator's job has many different aspects. They all center around collections care and long-term preservation of the object. This can include everything from studying the materials and techniques used to create an object, understanding the chemical and physical deterioration factors at risk, and carrying out hands-on conservation and restoration treatments. So conservators are trained in studio art, art history, and chemistry, and we really draw upon these three different fields in our work. So on a day-to-day basis, it can include everything from actually, you know, reattaching a broken fragment to a sculpture, to working with a conservation scientist to analyze materials, and to installing exhibitions with our team of registrars, art preparators, and curators. So there's really a lot of different aspects that go into working as a conservator. But I think one thing that is a really great part of it is just having this ability to look closely. So hopefully this is something, you know, in the conservation lab, we often do this with a microscope or using these analytical techniques, but it's something we can even do virtually with these models. So hopefully today, we can take a little bit of a closer look at some of the material evidence and you know, kind of the science-based aspects of object examination together.
That's wonderful. And you know, one of the things that I really love about conservation is how much of a team effort it is, right? You're constantly working with other members of the department and other departments within the museum to protect these objects. So it's a really great thing. And Jessica, I wanted to ask you, so we have a pretty good idea of what this object is, or, you know, it represents a two-dimensional or a four-dimensional house that has been flattened. And we know that it was likely used as burial materials to protect people in the afterlife, but we still don't have a really good grasp of what materials were used to make it, or even how it was made. So do you think you can give us a little bit of information about, you know, the likely materials that were used to create this object?
Yeah, of course. So this object is stone. I'm seeing in the chat window that some people are asking that if it's stone, if it's soapstone. We don't know exactly what kind of stone it is, but stone, you know, is made up of different inorganic minerals. So in conservation, we often kind of look at the material properties, and with minerals, we turn to the field of mineralogy and we think about the different properties. So we can look at chemical composition, crystal structure and form, color, hardness, density, optical properties, and all of these different aspects. So these all play into how we understand this object. And as a museum field that's kind of at the intersection of art and science, we tend to like to really quantify things and find data-rich measurements for objects. But there's also kind of another way to look at it is just looking at one aspect of one of these characteristics, which is hardness. So I also see some comments about how hard this object is. We don't know that, but we can start to think about how we might measure that. And one way that people have been looking at hardness for quite a while is using the Mohs hardness scale. So there are many ways to measure hardness, but this is just one of them, and it's a very relative scale. But it's been used for a long time, and it's quite applicable, and it gives us a really good kind of point of understanding and a way to grasp hardness as a material concept. So it was invented by Friedrich Mohs in 1812, and at the time, diamond was the hardest material, so that got a rating of 10, and there are much softer materials like talc that were given 1. So that really creates a relative sense of scratch hardness between materials. And this really directly relates to stone carving. So if you kind of conjure up an image of someone working in stone carving today, you might think of, a sculptor in their studio with a metal chisel carving away at a block of marble. Yeah, or maybe at home, using a diamond drill bit to drill through granite or some stone in construction even. So those are all working on this idea of different levels of hardness between tool and material being worked. But of course, if we think to ancient Mesoamerica, they were using a whole different range of tools. And we know, as Omar and I have talked about, and maybe we can talk about later, they were using stone tools to carve these objects at this time. And it's kind of a hard thing for us to even think about today, using a stone to carve another stone. But if we think about this relative scale, we can understand how much room there is within that to utilize one material to work another. And it's kind of amazing looking at this object, just to think about how much skill and knowledge. It's just such a complex thing to know exactly which stone could be used to carve another stone. And that would have been so laborious and time consuming and just so full of understanding and knowledge. It's now like embedded in this object. So I just love looking and thinking about how it would have been made.
Yeah, no, and if we think of, for example, the materials that would have been available, right? So we know Guerrero has a very diverse landscape, but it also tends to, the area of the Balsas River region where these objects are likely coming from, it's very mountainous, right? So there's a whole range of different metamorphic or volcanic rock that's available to them, but there's also softer stones that are spread out at different regions, right? So we know that, for example, some of those stones that are available in that region include like diorite, calcite, maybe even granite, right? So there's this whole range of possibilities of what people were using to, as base material to carve out this feature. And like you were saying, it's really the level of expertise that we're seeing. For example, these very straight lines here. And some people have remarked that one of the most interesting and beautiful things about this object is its simplicity. But that to achieve that level of simplicity and cleanness and very geometrically fine thing requires a very deep level of expertise, right? So I'm thinking, let's think about, for example, what kind of objects. So we know it likely use other stones to carve this stone, right? And if we think of that Mohs scale that you were talking about, it was likely a stone that's either harder or equally hard as this one, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's really cool. And Jessica, I'm noticing when I was moving this around, as part of our close looking observations, I saw that back here, the object actually has some scratches on different portions. So can you tell us a little bit of what might these relate to?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting aspect of this model. It also caught my eye when I was looking at it. And it's something that, as conservators, this is exactly what one of the things we're trained to do, is really assess the condition and look exactly for structural damage to an object. So if it's broken or there's losses, but also surface features like this. And this, yeah, definitely looks like a scratch. Often when we're looking at scratches on objects, they might appear lighter in color, like this is occurring here. And that's, especially with when you have a weathered or soiled surface, often from an archaeological context, you'll see that. And if we kind of look closely, thanks for zooming in, and you can explore this at home too, you can try to see the profile of the scratch, or just how wide it is. These are pretty fine and thin, and they kind of look like they were made with a pointed tool, and likely something much heavier. So it's quite possible that this was a metal tool that did this, or a really hard stone. We don't know. This did kind of occur before it came into the museum collection, so we're not, we're just hypothesizing about different potentials, but this object has such a long history. This could have happened anywhere from when it was being excavated to when it was being prepared for the art market, to even just being handled as it moved through collections in the more recent past. So yeah, it's really interesting to look closely. And it's one of the best things about being a conservator, I think, is looking under the microscope or looking closely and seeing these patterns of tool marks or damage and trying to piece together what that might have come from. Sometimes you can even link a pattern, a tool mark, to the individual tool used in a workshop. So it's really a fascinating part of studying objects closely.
And so that kind of level of detail requires, more further analysis in the lab and, talking to your colleagues and trying to assess what kind of tool might have been this, or what might have been used to make these scratches. And like you were mentioning, it was likely when we look at every other part of the object, we see that it's not necessarily something that's evident across the whole piece, right? So it was likely not something done during the production, but in its history afterwards. And like we were talking before, likely made either from between 500 BCE to 350 CE. So, and that's just the time for likely production. Its use of or its life history up until today, we think about now 2020, it's a long one. So there's a lot of things that could have happened to this object in that interim time, one thing that I can say, working extensive knowledge working in archaeological sites throughout Mesoamerica is when some of these objects are illicitly looted, looters are not necessarily conducting very, very scientific excavations. They're just plowing through with metal objects. So one of the possibilities is that when this object was looted, it was during that process that it got scratched by, let's say, a metal pick or a shovel or something along those lines. But again, it's still pretty impressive to see that scratches are basically one of the few signs of injury in this object, something that's been around for so long, yet it still has withstood, time and space, which makes me wonder, and it's something that, it always prompts us to further think if that was one of the intentions of building something out of stone like this, right? It was meant to withstand the damage of time, especially when we're thinking, it's made for the afterlife. So you would have to have something that, would continue onward. So, no, that's fascinating. And just like along that line, along the line of these histories denoting this longer history for the object, we see that it also has multiple numbering sequences. Particularly, I'm pointing at them here. We see this one that says 339, 154. We have this longer text here, M2001 to the 12.40, and we have this other, what seems to be almost like a sticker here, along with some additional scratches here in the bottom. That might just be from the object being placed. But can you tell us a bit more about these numbers? What do they mean? What do they tell you as a conservator?
Yeah, so these numbers definitely all, are part of the later life of this object post-excavation. And it is kind of unusual that so many, because usually when an object is in the museum, typically it gets one number. So if we look at the bottom there on that number that starts with an M, that is the most recent number. That's our LACMA accession number. So an accession number is a number given to an object when it comes into the museum, generally physically labeled on the object, and that helps us keep track of it. Physically, also keep all of its records and research associated with it together so that we don't lose any more information. It's so great that curators and researchers can learn so much more about an object, and we want to keep all that information together. Those types of numbers are typically applied today in a discrete location. So it's kind of a neat treat today that we can see this underside, because if you went to visit an exhibition at LACMA, you probably won't see accession numbers on objects. They're usually hidden in discrete locations. And today, we also apply them using really carefully thinking about the materials we're using so that they don't do any irreversible damage to the object. But of course, the idea, of tracking an object in an inventory is not new. So these other numbers most likely relate to it moving through other collections, either through dealers or collectors. And as you pointed out, there are the two numbers on the side. Those look like they're applied with pen or ink or possibly paint.
Right.
Even the 154, you see it as kind of blurry edges, which kind of tells me that it's something that's kind of started to permeate into the porosity of the stone. And then the one on the bottom is what we would call a self-adhesive paper label. That looks almost like ballpoint pen to me, but it's something we could also look more closely at. So unfortunately, in the past, these weren't always applied with more reversible materials. Some might be able to be removed, but the interesting thing is that they actually are representative of part of the object's history at this point. So the silver lining kind of having a large number on there is that maybe it could be connected to an inventory or an archival record to help us learn a little bit more about the life of this object. So it really has a lot of, it can have a lot of research value.
It just shows you how a lot of these objects, we're thinking about them as being produced and used in the past, but really they're being used now. They have a history and a life use that continues till today, and it's very evident in these classifying systems, right? Jessica, can you tell us a little bit about, this is the number that we add in the museum, and you said it's all of these markings that we add are really take into consideration how to protect the object as well. So what kind of materials would you use to mark something out of stone, or any other material for that matter?
Yeah, there are several ways to go about it, but one way that's most common is really to put down a barrier layer of an acrylic resin. So we use a lot of different acrylic resins in conservation because they're shown to be very stable over time, the ones that we use. And that can kind of help prevent ink or paint from being drawn into a porous substrate. And then we make sure we either use a pigment-based pen or paint that we know is light fast to mark on top of that resin layer. So you really have this kind of multi-system step, so you can carefully, we know exactly what solvents react with which resins, so we can remove and edit if needed, and really be sure that we can safely remove from an object. But this is something for every object can be different, so it's not like we just have one set of pens that we go to mark the objects with. It really is a thought about, is this stone, is this leather, is this fabric? There's a whole range of materials that we'll use. So even just that small idea of putting a number on an object really is, there's quite a lot of thought that goes into it.
Right. No, that's really good to hear that it's reversible in some ways as well, right? So there's really no harm to the objects, and it allows us to keep track of this inventory of materials, right? And the history of research, really, because once it's in the museum, we're lucky enough to have the opportunity to look closely at this object like we're doing today and have conversations, but really record those conversations and have a record of what people has researched in the past and what questions we might ask moving into the future. Jessica, this has been super interesting. And it's clear that, as conservators, you really think about every single element of the art and the object in and of itself. How do you bring together all this knowledge to the museum, in ways that you can maybe use this information to protect this object further, so it'll always be there for our audiences in the future?
Yeah. One thing that I know we always like to talk about is, or I like to talk about, is treatment. So, if we're thinking about interventive treatment, which is just one small portion of conservation, that's something where we're really, when we're taking that step to intervene in an object, we really want to make sure we understand all of these aspects we've been talking about today. So we've thoroughly examined it. We understand the material properties. We understand how it was used and what that context is. And we understand how it might continue to deteriorate. And if we opt to add any materials to the object, we know how those will interact with the surface and that they'll be stable and compatible. So there's a lot that goes into that. And even we think back to that Mohs hardness scale we were talking about earlier. So if I need to use an adhesive or create a fill to compensate for a loss in an object, I'll choose a material quite frequently that's softer than that original material. And that allows me to finish and shape that fill without damaging the original surface, because that's really a tenet of modern conservation, is we want to preserve as much of that original material as possible. But I think even more importantly is how we look at preventive conservation. So this is much like it sounds like, it's what we do to prevent damage from ever happening to an object. So that's really our goal in the museum setting, right? We're caretakers, custodians for these objects, and we want to do everything in our power, use all of our knowledge to protect them. So
exactly.
Yeah, so like if we also think back to this idea of the hardness, this impacts even the way we handle the object. We want to protect from damage by physical forces. So, if I'm wearing a ring with a hard stone in it, that can easily scratch an object, even through gloves. So we have a team of really skilled art preparators who handle all of the objects. They install them for exhibitions. we work with a team of mount makers, and they design supports for the object so that if there's an earthquake, they won't fall over or be damaged. And they're often working with metal, so they might choose, if they have to put metal on a softer stone object, they would pad it out so that you don't get scratches like we're seeing now. So there are so many different aspects, and it really is a team effort, because we also think about the climate, the correct temperature and relative humidity, pests, how the object is housed and stored. So that involves working with collections managers, facilities, carpenters. There's just a huge abundance of people that are involved in this preventive conservation and preserving the LACMA collection for the future. And of course, education, always doing their role to share the stories at the core of these objects. So we're really appreciative for that as well.
So it takes a village, right, to maintain and protect these objects going into the future.
Definitely, yeah.
You know, Jessica, I'm thinking, how about we can start opening up to questions, and see what people are asking and seeing what they might like to know from this object from us.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna ask Laura if just a reminder, if you could place your questions into the Q&A box of Zoom, we will go and try and answer your questions there. And I'll just say ahead of time, if we don't have an answer for you at this moment, we will try and get one to you later. So what question?
Thanks, Omar. So thank you and Jessica as well. That was such an interesting discussion. I've been scanning through the chat, and throughout we've been getting questions from people who are really curious about the type of stone that was used to make this object. They really want to know the size of this object. Any more information that you can provide about that, I think, would be really helpful.
Sure. So I think, like, as Jessica and I were talking about before, there's a range of possibilities of the kind of stones that might have been used to actually carve out to create this object. Now, you're saying some of the materials that are available in that area include calcite, diorite, granite, and there's limestone up there as well. And then farther south in what's known as the Motagua River region of Guatemala, we also start to get jade and jadeite as well, which is a very hard stone. Unfortunately, we specifically for this object, we would have to do, and Jessica can elaborate on this, we would have to do a lot more actual analyses of the mineral and chemical composition of the object to actually determine the specific stone that was used to make this object. I think, Jessica, you can elaborate a bit more on that. But
yeah, I think that it's interesting. This object hasn't been into the conservation lab recently, so it's something we could research further to learn more about the specific type of stone. But it is an interesting point that we didn't really have time to talk about in the main portion. But there are a lot of different analytical and instrumental techniques that can be used to evaluate stone. But one thing we often consider in conservation is that this idea of destructive versus non-destructive testing. So for some of the ways that we would use to characterize stone, we would have to take a sample. And that's something that we do occasionally for objects, especially when it can be done really small and has a really strong research reason behind it, in consultation with all of the caretakers of that object. But it's something that we really have to think carefully about and think about what instrumentation we have access to. So hopefully we can bring this object in soon and take a closer look with the microscope and study and think, but it is interesting when you consider, how a mineralogist looks at a stone versus how a conservator does, which is you might be able to take a large sample and study a cross section of it under the microscope, a polished section, or use X-ray diffraction or these other techniques, whereas sometimes we hold back a little bit more because we're more interested in preserving, the work of art as a whole rather than getting to those specific mineral questions. But it's definitely an interesting thing just to think about what type of stone this might be, and hopefully we can learn more soon.
Yeah, no, and I can say, just to build off on that from the archaeological perspective, the archaeological side of this is a lot of the work that archaeologists do when they're investigating not only specific objects, but sites as a whole is, if we know that there's a lot of stonework happening, they try and find where are the quarries. A lot of times these come from, the raw material is cut in bulk and taken and then split up into different pieces and then manipulated, right? And then worked at a different area. But you're able to trace where these quarries are, but it's a very painstaking form of research because it means, you go out to the field and you go out to near these sites, and sometimes you go into the hills to find where these possible quarries could have been located. And so it just means that at this point, we may not have all the answers, but there's so much room, so much opportunity for further research. And that's something I would really like to emphasize for, when you're talking to your students, that it's not that we know everything, because we absolutely do not. There's always space to continue learning. There's always space to ask more questions. There's always space for more research and more collaborative work with the communities and descendant communities that made these objects. So that's always an opportunity that we have moving forward into the future. So yeah, that's a great question.
But wait, but let's not forget the most pressing question is, how big is it? I don't think we've told them.
How big is it? It's small. Small. It's around 8 inches, actually. Let me find the actual measurements on here.
We should have made it a guessing game and people could have submitted.
Should have made it a guessing game? Yeah, I should have. No, it's very small. It's around 8 inches. So it's not very large. In fact, I can say, just to give you a relative scale, it's a little bit smaller than my hand right here. So yeah, they're kind of small pieces. So, because again, they're not meant to, or from our understandings, they're not meant to represent full-scale houses. They're not meant to represent larger temples. They're smaller abstract renditions of what houses might be. And I think one of the questions